Dan built a system that paid him first, before rent, bills, anything. Every paycheck split itself. Savings here, investments there, fun money over there. Months later, he opened the account and saw it. $12,000. $12,000. No side hustle. No burnout. How I automated my finances and saved $12,000. The sound that woke him wasn't an alarm. It was softer, more insistent. The faint buzz of a phone vibrating against a wooden nightstand. Daniel Everett was not the kind of man to check his phone before getting out of bed. But something about this buzz was different. It wasn't the rhythm of a text message or the elongated vibration of a call. It was short, precise. A notification. Half asleep, he reached out, his fingers fumbling for the cold glass edge of the phone. The sunlight was already spilling in through the blinds, those long, striped beams cutting across the far wall of his bedroom. A muted hum from the street below drifted up, the city just beginning to wake. When the screen came to life, he squinted. It was his bank's app, an automated alert. For a moment, he considered swiping it away and going back to the warm gravity of his pillow. But something tugged at him. He tapped the notification, thumbprint authentication, sliding him past the lock screen. And there it was. His savings account balance was $12,438.16 higher than it had been at the start of last month. No windfall. No recent contract payment. Just more. Dan's mind flicked instantly to the practical explanations. Refund? No, nothing that size. Bank error? Highly unlikely. Some forgotten freelance payment. Impossible. He tracked invoices like a hawk. He sat up slowly, the mattress creaking under his weight. His short dark hair, streaked with just enough gray to betray his 41 years, caught a glint of sunlight in the mirror across the room. He scrolled down through the transaction history, eyes scanning for anything obvious. But there were no single, large deposits. Only a series of small, precise movements. $500 transfer from checking. $200 transfer from checking. $75 round-up deposit. $300 auto transfer from checking again. It was like watching the tide come in. Not a single wave, but dozens, each one lapping a little further up the sand. And then, as he scrolled back months, then years, the realization bloomed in his mind. This wasn't random. This wasn't a lucky month. This was the quiet work of a system he put in place almost 2 years ago, and then forgotten about. The memory came back like a scene from another life. 19 months earlier, he had been sitting at the exact same kitchen counter he would soon be walking toward, head bent over his laptop at nearly midnight. A half-empty mug of black coffee had gone cold at his elbow. His shoulders were tense, eyes flicking between a spreadsheet, 3 different banking tabs, and the landlord's online rent portal. Every month, it was the same cycle. Rent due on the 1st. Utilities staggered across the 1st and 3rd. Credit card on the 9th. Internet on the 15th. Each one required logging in, checking balances, and remembering which card to use. It wasn't that he was bad with money. He wasn't. But the constant attention it required was exhausting. That night, he'd muttered to himself, "There has to be a better way." He'd heard of financial automation before. Friends swore by it. Personal finance blogs treated it like gospel. But to him, it felt risky, like letting go of the steering wheel while still barreling down the highway. What if a bill amount changed? What if a transfer happened before a deposit cleared? What if he forgot it was all happening and got overdrawn? The fear wasn't irrational. Years ago, fresh out of college, he'd had an auto payment hit the day before his paycheck arrived. The overdraft fee had been small, but the embarrassment stuck. Since then, he'd kept everything manual, convinced it kept him in control. What he didn't realize back then was that he wasn't in control at all. He was just involved. Now, standing in the soft morning light with his phone in one hand, Dan could feel the difference. This $12,000 didn't appear by magic. It had arrived one small, invisible decision at a time, decisions he no longer had to make, because the system made them for him. He swung his legs out of bed and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The floorboards had a familiar, uneven creak. He placed the phone on the counter, reached for the French press, and scooped in the coffee grounds. The kettle whistled softly, steam curling up into the still air. While the water steeped, he tapped through the months in his bank history again. The pattern was unmistakable. On the 1st and 15th of every month, without fail, money slid from checking to savings. On Mondays, spare change from debit card purchases rounded up to the nearest dollar and moved into a micro-investing account. Utility bills and rent cleared without his intervention. It was the hum of a machine he'd built and then left to run. He remembered the day he set the first piece in motion. It had been raining, the kind of steady, unhurried rain that drummed against the apartment windows and made the streets glisten like black glass. With nothing pressing on his schedule, he had decided to finally tackle what he called his financial traffic jam. He started with the biggest mental load: rent. The rent portal allowed autopay, so he linked his checking account and set the payment to hit on the first of each month. Then he moved on to utilities, batching them all to draft from his credit card. This way, he could track them in one place and earn points, paying the card off in full automatically each month. Next came savings. He set a fixed $500 transfer from checking to his high-yield savings account on the 1st, and another $200 on the 15th. The amounts felt ambitious, but not dangerous. He told himself he could always pause them if things got tight. Finally, he enabled a roundup program through his bank, skimming a few cents from every debit transaction into a separate account. It was barely noticeable, and yet, as he now saw, it added up. The whole setup took less than 2 hours. And then he forgot about it. What automation gave him wasn't just extra money. It was mental bandwidth. Before automation, Dan's mornings often started with a low hum of financial anxiety. Did he pay the gas bill? Was the credit card due today or tomorrow? Could he really afford to put $300 in his savings this week? The questions were constant, like background noise you can't turn off. After automation, mornings were quieter, not silent. He still checked his accounts once a week, just to keep a pulse on things. But the heavy lifting happened without him. Bills were paid. Savings grew. Investments ticked upward. And now, nearly 2 years later, he was waking up to proof of how powerful that shift had been. He poured his coffee, the rich smell wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. Outside, a bus rumbled past. Somewhere down the block, a bakery door opened, letting the smell of warm bread drift into the street. He took a sip, leaning against the counter, phone still open to the banking app. The balance at the top of the screen wasn't just a number. It was a story, one written quietly, in the background, without him even having to hold the pen. It made him wonder, if this much could happen while he wasn't paying attention, what could happen if he did? That question lingered as he rinsed his cup and set it in the sink. His bike helmet hung by the door, waiting for the short ride downtown to the co-working space where he ran his small data consulting business. Normally, he'd spend the first hour there diving into client dashboards. But today, he felt a pull to do something else first. Maybe he'd reopen the automation settings, see if there were tweaks to make, little adjustments to accelerate the savings. Maybe increase the transfers by $50, or link a cashback card for recurring expenses. It wasn't that he needed the money desperately, but the peace of mind, that he wanted more of. He glanced at the time. Still 20 minutes before he needed to leave. The phone screen dimmed and went black, reflecting his own faint image back at him. A man a little older, a little wiser, with a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. Not because of the money itself, though, yes, $12,000 was nothing to ignore, but because it had arrived without stealing his time or attention. It had arrived while he lived his life. And that, he realized, was the real point. It started with the rain. Not the angry, wind-driven kind that made you rush to close windows. No, this was the steady, unhurried rain that softened the air, muted the city, and made the streets gleam like poured ink. Dan had always liked days like this. They made the world smaller, quieter. He stood by the window for a while that morning, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching droplets chase each other down the glass. The trees along the block swayed gently, their leaves flashing dark green to light as they turned in the breeze. His laptop sat closed on the kitchen counter, its slim silver shell catching the pale light. He knew what was waiting inside it. Tabs he'd left open the night before. One for his checking account, one for his credit card, one for utilities, one for his budget spreadsheet. And behind all that, the truth. He was tired of doing this by hand. Dan wasn't drowning in debt. He wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. But managing his finances felt like managing an unruly garden, weeds popping up faster than he could pull them. The monthly routine was predictable. Week 1, rent and the power bill. Week 2, internet, and the smaller credit card payment. Week 3, water bill and streaming subscriptions. Week 4, the big credit card bill. It wasn't the money itself that wore him down. It was the process, logging in, scheduling payments, cross-checking amounts, making sure nothing had changed. Every month, some part of him braced for a forgotten due date or a balance that was higher than expected. That bracing, that low-level tension, was exhausting. He set his coffee down and opened the laptop. The rain outside became the soundtrack as the screen came alive. His checking account balance blinked into view, steady but not impressive. He flipped to his savings account. Not bad, but not where he wanted it to be. He thought about a conversation he'd had months ago with a friend, a software engineer who treated his finances like one of his projects. "You know the trick?" the friend had said. "Don't think about it. Build it once and let it run." At the time, Dan had laughed. "Sounds nice in theory, but I like to know where my money's going." His friend had shrugged. "You'll still know. You just won't have to babysit it." Today, the idea felt less theoretical. Today, the rain made the world feel slow enough for him to try. He opened a blank document and titled it, Automation Plan. Step 1. Identify the fixed expenses. He typed them out, line by line. Rent, $1,350 first. Utilities, $110 to $140. Varies, due third. Internet, $60 15th. Credit card number 1, $320 to $350, due 9th. Credit card number 2, $150, due 21st. Subscriptions, $48, due 16th. He stared at the list for a moment. There was something comforting about seeing it all in one place, the hard edges of his financial landscape. Step 2. Assign a payment method. This was where things could get messy. Dan decided to batch as much as possible. Rent, direct from checking. Utilities and internet, charged to credit card number 1. Subscriptions, charged to credit card number 2. That way, instead of remembering 6 different due dates, he'd just have to ensure the 2 cards were paid off in full each month. Step 3. Pay himself first. This was the part he'd always struggled with, saving consistently. Sure, he'd move money into savings when he had extra, but that was irregular at best. Too often, the extra was eaten up by impulse spending. So he set a rule for himself. A $500 transfer from checking to savings on the 1st of every month. Another $200 on the 15th. He hesitated before typing it in. $700 a month felt like a lot. But he reminded himself, savings transfers could be reversed in an emergency. Spending money that never made it to savings? That was gone for good. Step 4. Add micro savings. Dan had read about roundup programs that skimmed the cents off each purchase and moved them into savings or investments. It sounded gimmicky, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Small amounts, invisible to his day-to-day budget, could accumulate without resistance. He opened his banking app and enabled the feature. Every debit purchase would now round up to the nearest dollar, the difference slipping into a micro-investing account. Step 5. Automate investments. His freelance income wasn't consistent enough for aggressive investing, but he could commit to $150 a month into a diversified index fund. He set the draft for the 20th, far enough from his rent payment to avoid overlap. The whole process, from the first click to the last confirmation, took less than 2 hours. By the time he closed his laptop, the rain outside had lightened to a fine mist. The street below glistened. Dan poured himself another cup of coffee and felt something he hadn't associated with money in a long time: relief. That night, lying in bed, he wondered if he'd overcomplicated things. Would all these little transfers trip over each other? Would he have to monitor them constantly? But the weeks rolled by without incident. The first month, the rent pulled on the 1st. The utility bill posted to credit card number 1. The $500 savings transfer happened quietly. He didn't even notice until 3 days later. The second month, a work project paid out late, but the staggered nature of his automation kept things afloat. The $200 mid-month savings transfer still went through. The third month, he checked his savings balance and realized it had grown by nearly $2,100 without him doing anything beyond his initial setup. And, with each passing month, the system became less of an experiment and more of a habit. Now, almost 2 years later, as he sat in his kitchen on that bright morning, $12,438 richer. He realized something important. The hard part hadn't been building the system. The hard part had been trusting it. He thought about how many people resisted automation the way he had, afraid of losing control, when in reality, control was exactly what it gave you. Automation didn't mean ignoring your finances. It meant designing them so the right thing happened by default. The rain that day had been the quiet nudge he needed to start. And this morning's surprise was proof that it had been worth it. He took a final sip of coffee, glanced at the clock, and reached for his bike helmet. As he stepped out into the warm sunlight, he thought, maybe I'll share this story. Maybe someone else is still doing it the hard way. And with that, he pedaled away, the sound of his tires on the pavement a steady rhythm, as steady as the system still working quietly behind the scenes. The first 3 months after setting up his automation system were almost suspiciously smooth. It was as if the universe was rewarding him for finally getting his financial act together. Rent payments sailed out on the first of each month without a hitch. Utility bills hit the credit card like clockwork, always paid in full by the autopay draft. Savings transfers stacked up quietly in his high-yield account. It was so smooth that, by the 4th month, Dan found himself checking his accounts less and less. Not because he was avoiding them, but because there was nothing urgent to fix. And then, in the 5th month, everything changed. It started with an email. Subject: change in project timeline. Dan had been consulting for a mid-sized tech company for nearly a year. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. 2 days a week, he'd sit in their open-plan office, building custom data dashboards while sipping their too-strong coffee. The email was polite, apologetic even, but the subtext was clear. Funding delays. Projects paused. Payments postponed. It wasn't a total shutdown. He'd still get paid eventually. But the regular bi-weekly deposits he'd built his budget around, those were on hold for at least a month. Dan stared at the email for a long moment, his green eyes narrowing as the words sank in. A year ago, this kind of news would have triggered immediate panic. He'd be mentally rearranging bills, calculating which payments could be delayed without penalty, wondering if he needed to pull from savings, or worse, carry a balance on the credit card. But now, he had something he'd never had before, a preset system designed to operate without his constant intervention. Still, the worry crept in. Could the automation actually hold up without the usual cash flow? Would the savings transfers still go through? Would the auto-pay bills bounce and trigger overdrafts? He took a deep breath and decided to do something radical, something the old version of himself would have never done. He did nothing. For the first week, he left everything untouched. The $500 savings transfer still moved out on the first. Rent cleared without issue. The utilities posted to the credit card as usual, and the auto-pay pulled the balance from his checking account on the scheduled date. When he checked his balance after that first week, it was lower, of course it was. But it wasn't dangerous. The system had built enough of a cushion that even without the bi-weekly deposit, he wasn't scrambling. By the second week, the delayed payment from the tech company was starting to feel real. Dan's checking account balance had dipped further, but his savings account was quietly larger than it had ever been. He smiled at the irony. In the old days, he would have stopped saving entirely the second his income became uncertain. Now, savings was the default. Spending was the exception. Still, by the third week, he decided to take a closer look. He sat at the same kitchen counter where, on that rainy Saturday, he first built his automation plan. The French press sat in front of him, steam curling lazily from the spout. He opened his spreadsheet and pulled up the latest bank data. Checking, lower than usual, but still above his self-imposed comfort line. Savings, growing. Credit cards, zero balance. Utilities and rent, paid. He felt a flicker of pride. The system wasn't just holding. It was holding because of the rules he'd set from the start. It hadn't been magic. It had been structure. Pay yourself first, which meant savings transfers happened before anything else. Batch bills, so he wasn't juggling multiple due dates. Spend last, because what wasn't in checking wasn't tempting him to use it. The result? Even when income slowed, the essentials were covered. By the fourth week, the payment from the tech company finally came through. The relief was real, but it was different than it would have been before. A year ago, a late payment like this would have sent his budget into chaos, scrambling to delay bills, possibly paying late fees, definitely losing sleep. This time, he realized, the chaos had been absorbed entirely by the system. He hadn't skipped a bill. He hadn't carried a credit card balance. He hadn't even touched his emergency fund. That night, he sat on a small balcony, a cool breeze drifting in from the street below. The city was alive, faint music from a bar down the block, the low hum of passing cars, the occasional laughter from pedestrians heading home. Dan leaned back in his chair and thought about the past month. The automation hadn't made him immune to financial hiccups, but it had changed his posture toward them. Before, he would have been hunched forward, bracing against the hit. Now, he was standing upright, letting the system take the force for him. He thought about the advice he'd give someone else starting from scratch. Don't wait until things are going well to set up automation. Build it when you still feel the pinch, so it's ready to catch you when the pinch becomes a squeeze. That night, with the city still buzzing softly below, he opened his banking app one more time. The numbers weren't perfect, but they were stable. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that stability mattered more than perfection. He set the phone down, poured himself a glass of water, and made a mental note for the morning. Review automation settings. Increase savings transfer by $50. Not because he had to, but because he could. The stress test had done something unexpected. It hadn't weakened his trust in the system. It had deepened it. When the payment from the tech company finally arrived, late but intact, Dan's first reaction was relief. Not the wild, desperate relief he'd felt in his 20s when a late paycheck meant the difference between paying rent and racking up late fees. No, this was quieter, measured, the kind of relief that comes when you know you would have been okay either way. The stress test had been unexpected, but it had also been the perfect trial run for the automation system he'd built nearly 2 years earlier. The bills had been paid. Savings had grown. Credit cards remained at zero. And through it all, he hadn't had to scramble or rearrange his life. Now, as he sat in the mid-morning calm of his co-working space, sunlight stretching in long rectangles across the polished floor, he realized something important. If the first layer of automation was designed to keep the ship steady, the second layer could make it sail faster. He opened his laptop. It hummed to life, the reflection of tall windows shifting faintly across the screen. He navigated to the folder where his original document lived, the one he'd titled Automation Plan on that rainy Saturday. The date stamp read 19 months ago. The simplicity of it made him smile. Rent, auto pay from checking, utilities and internet, billed to credit card number 1. Subscriptions, billed to credit card number 2. Savings, $500 transfer on the 1st, $200 on the 15th. Roundup savings to micro-investing account. Investments, $150 to index fund on the 20th. It had been enough to transform his finances from a constant background stress into something almost invisible. But now, he wanted to go beyond invisibility. He wanted optimization. The first thought that came to him was consistency. The stress test had revealed an unevenness in his expenses, the peaks in certain months when bills spiked. Winter brought higher heating costs. Summer sent electricity bills soaring. It was predictable, but still disruptive. He dug through his email archives for his utility bills, opening them one by one. The numbers confirmed his memory. $140 for gas in January, $95 in March, $85 for electricity in April, $162 in July. The inconsistency was a speed bump for automation, and speed bumps slow systems down. So, he clicked into his utility provider's portal and found exactly what he was looking for: balanced billing. By enrolling, his payments would be averaged over the year. No more seasonal spikes. No more budget surprises. The fixed monthly amount might be a little higher than the lowest months, but that was fine. Predictability was worth paying for. It took 2 minutes to enroll. One click. One confirmation. One more piece of volatility removed from his financial life. His second move was about maintenance. The $150 he'd been investing each month in his index fund was good, but he knew that portfolio drift was inevitable. Some assets would grow faster than others, shifting the allocation he'd set. Without rebalancing, the portfolio could become riskier than intended. Manual rebalancing meant logging in, running numbers, and making trades. And, frankly, he knew himself well enough to know that months could slip by before he got around to it. So, he opened his investment platform and enabled automatic rebalancing, quarterly, At his 80/20th target split between equities and bonds. It was a quiet form of discipline, the kind that compounds over decades. Next came something more subtle, overflow capture. He'd noticed that some months ended with more money in checking than expected. In the old days, that extra cash was dangerous, too easy to spend on impulse purchases that felt harmless in the moment. Now, he wanted that overflow to work for him automatically. He set a rule: keep $2,500 in checking as a buffer. Any amount above that, on the last day of the month, would sweep directly into savings. No decision required. No temptation to treat himself before moving it. The final addition was the one he found most satisfying: visual tracking. Dan had never been one for decorative planners or elaborate spreadsheets, but he understood the motivational power of seeing growth over time. Numbers on a statement were abstract. A visual graph made progress tangible. He built a simple Google sheet with 3 big numbers across the top. Checking balance, always target $2,500. Savings balance goal, $25,000 by year's end. Investments total goal, $40,000. Below that, a clean line graph showing growth month by month. He linked it to pull data automatically from his accounts every Sunday night. Weekly updates, not daily, to keep his focus on the long game. When he was done, the document had grown from a one-page plan into something more like a system blueprint. Layer 1 had been about protection. Bills paid on time. Savings happening without thought. Investments seeded regularly. Layer 2 was about refinement. Smoothing volatility. Maintaining balance. Capturing excess. Seeing the story unfold visually. That night, back at his apartment, he sat at the kitchen counter with a plate of roasted vegetables and salmon, laptop open beside his dinner. The new tracker glowed on the screen. Bars inching upward. Lines bending steadily higher. It was a kind of satisfaction that had nothing to do with luxury or status. It was quiet, rooted in knowing that the system didn't need him hovering over it. If he wanted to check in, he could. If he wanted to ignore it for a week, he could. Either way, it would keep moving forward. The real breakthrough wasn't about making more money. It was about designing his financial life so that the default outcome was progress. If he did nothing for a month, he'd be better off at the end of it than at the start. If a client payment was late again, the buffer would catch it. If a random expense popped up, it wouldn't throw the whole plan off balance. The peace of mind from that default state was worth more than any single deposit. 2 weeks later, the first overflow sweep triggered. Dan had ended the month with $3,148 in checking, $648 over his buffer. That night, as he read on the couch, his phone buzzed. Transfer complete. $648 moved to savings. He laughed softly to himself. The money had moved while he was doing nothing but turning pages in a novel. A month after that, the quarterly rebalance alert popped up. He opened it out of curiosity. The system had shifted a small percentage from equities to bonds to maintain his 80/20th allocation. He smiled. No manual trades. No second-guessing. Just a system doing exactly what he'd told it to do. One Friday, he was having lunch with a friend who ran his own business. The friend was stressed, juggling invoices and bill reminders, asking if Dan still kept a close eye on every transaction. Not really, Dan said, swirling the last sip of coffee in his cup. I keep an eye on the system. The system keeps an eye on the money. 3 months after building the second layer, his tracker showed savings up $4,300. Investments up $2,900. Every bill paid without a single manual click. But the number he valued most wasn't on the tracker. It was the hours he'd gotten back. Hours that used to go to logging in, shifting funds, remembering due dates. Hours he now spent cycling to the waterfront, cooking with friends, reading under the soft light of his balcony lamp. The truth was simple. The first layer of automation had given him stability. The second layer had given him freedom. Freedom not to think about money every day. Freedom to focus on the parts of life automation couldn't replace. And for the first time, he began to wonder what a third layer might look like. It started with a group text. Dan had just finished his morning ride, a winding loop that took him along the river and back through the quiet side streets, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He stopped on the sidewalk outside a corner cafe, pulling the phone out with one hand while wiping sweat from his forehead with the other. Text from Liam. We're doing it. Mexico. 10 days. Flights are cheap right now. Who's in? Below it, The thread exploded with responses. Tessa. Yeses. Finally. Maya. I need this. My boss is killing me. Liam again. Dan? You in? Dan stared at the screen. A 10-day trip to Mexico sounded amazing. Sunday beaches. Street tacos. Long afternoons under shade, umbrellas with nothing to do but listen to the ocean. It had been over a year since he'd taken more than a long weekend off. But then another thought hit. How much would this actually cost me? In the old days, that question would have led to a scramble. He'd have mentally run through upcoming bills, rent due dates, maybe even scribble numbers on a napkin to see if the trip was possible without maxing a card. Now, he had a different tool, the system. Back in his apartment, he dropped his helmet on the counter, poured a glass of water, and opened his laptop. The financial tracker came up first, those three big numbers across the top like calm, steady sentinels. Checking, $2,543. Savings, $18,740. Investments, $35,812. Below that, the neat line graphs told their quiet story. Dan knew the rules. Checking was capped at $2,500 for the buffer. Anything above that was swept to savings at month's end. Savings transfers happen automatically, and those funds were earmarked for long-term goals, not impulse trips. Investments were even more hands-off. So the real question was, what could he spend without touching the system's core? He clicked into his checking account's activity. The rent for the month had cleared. The utility autopay was set. Credit card autopays were scheduled. His next savings transfer was due in 5 days. Money that would move no matter what. That meant any trip expenses would have to come from one of two places. The natural buffer in checking before the sweep. A dedicated, fun money account he'd started 9 months ago. A small side pot funded by $100 a month from overflow sweeps. The fun money account was at $1,230. The checking account had about $40 above buffer, and another sweep wouldn't happen for 3 weeks. That put him at roughly $1,270 available for a trip without disturbing savings or investment goals. He thought about it. Flights to Mexico were on sale, $340 round trip. A mid-range Airbnb split 4 ways would be maybe $450 each. That left about $480 for food, transportation, and activities. Tight but doable. And here's where the system worked its quiet magic. Because the fun money account existed, and because he'd been funding it without even noticing, he didn't have to weigh this trip against his larger goals. It was separate. It was already decided. Still, he wanted to be sure. He pulled up the tracker again, looking at the savings goal bar, just over halfway to his $25,000 target. The thought of dipping into it for a vacation felt wrong. That money was future security, not temporary pleasure. The fun money, though, that was exactly what it was for. He texted the group, "Count me in, but I'm only bringing 1 carry-on. No checked luggage fees." 2 weeks later, Dan was standing barefoot on the edge of a white sand beach, the Pacific stretching out in front of him like an endless silver blue sheet. The sun was warm but not brutal, a steady breeze carrying the faint smell of grilled fish from a food stand down shore. He dug his toes into the sand, took a sip of the icy drink in his hand, and realized something. He wasn't thinking about money. Not in the ignore it and hope it's fine way he might have once. Not in the I'll deal with the damage when I get home way either. But in the confident way of someone who knew the trip had been paid for before it even started. One evening, halfway through the trip, he sat on the Airbnb's shaded balcony, his laptop open as the others napped inside. He checked his email and saw the automated $200 mid-month savings transfer had gone through. There it was. Even while he was here, sipping fresh lime juice in another country, the system was still moving money toward his goals. It made him smile. A small, private smile. When the trip ended and he returned home, he opened his accounts to assess the aftermath. Checking, $2,504. Savings, $18,940. Investments, $36,102. The fun money account had been drawn down to $32. The buffer was intact. Savings and investments had grown while he was away. He realized something important. The trip had cost money, sure, but it hadn't cost momentum. That weekend, over coffee with Liam, the topic came up. Liam admitted he'd put most of the trip on his credit card and would pay it off over the next few months. Dan nodded, but didn't offer advice. Liam hadn't asked for it. Instead, he just said, "I set up this thing a while back. Pays for stuff like that automatically. Makes it easier to say yes without worrying." Back at his apartment, Dan sat with his laptop and updated the tracker. He added a new bar under the big 3, fun money account. It wasn't as important as the others, but it felt good to see it there, a reminder that the system wasn't only about restraint. It was also about permission. He'd built the system to protect his future self. But this trip reminded him that a well-built system also protects the present self, the part of him that still wanted experiences, connection, and the occasional flight to somewhere warm. The temptation test, he thought, had been a bigger success than the stress test in some ways. Anyone could survive by cutting spending in a crisis. But saying yes to something joyful, and doing it without sabotaging the long-term plan, that was the real sign the system was working. He closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and let himself remember the smell of the ocean, the soft hum of cicadas, the sound of waves against the shore. Automation, he thought, wasn't just about money. It was about making room for more of this. It happened slowly, too slowly to notice at first. Dan's freelance work had been steady for nearly 2 years, but now it was shifting into something bigger. Referrals were coming in more often. Old clients were returning with new projects. And one Tuesday morning, while sipping coffee at the co-working space, his inbox pinged with an offer from a new client in San Francisco. They needed him for a 3-month data overhaul, and the pay was almost double his usual rate. He accepted, of course. It was good work, the kind he could lose himself in for hours, and it didn't hurt that the paychecks would be some of the largest deposits he'd seen in years. The first high-paying invoice cleared in early May. Dan glanced at the number on the bank app, smiled, and went back to his lunch. He didn't think much about it at first, but small changes started to creep in. The $4 black coffee he usually bought twice a week became a $6 oat milk latte every morning. The groceries he used to plan carefully turned into spur-of-the-moment market trips, with artisan cheeses and fresh bakery bread tucked under his arm. And one evening, while browsing online, he found himself adding a $300 pair of wireless headphones to his cart without the usual pause. None of these purchases were catastrophic. None of them even made a noticeable dent in his balance. But the pattern was unmistakable. Lifestyle creep, the quiet drift upward in spending as income rises, had slipped in like a polite guest, making itself comfortable without asking. On a Sunday morning, Dan sat at his kitchen counter, staring at the weekly update on his tracker. The graph still pointed up, but the slope on his savings had flattened slightly. That alone made him frown. The old Dan wouldn't have noticed. He would have focused on the fact that the checking account was still full, that the bills were still paid. But the new Dan, the one who had built this system piece by piece, knew better. If spending grew every time income grew, savings wouldn't accelerate. It would stagnate. He closed the tracker and opened his automation plan. It was time to make adjustments. First adjustment: increase savings transfers. He decided that 50% of every income increase would be captured before it even hit checking. The San Francisco contract was paying $2,000 more per month than his previous work. That meant $1,000 of it would be diverted directly to savings on the first of each month, starting immediately. He logged into his bank's transfer settings, clicked Edit, and increased the automatic savings transfer from $500 to $1,500. Second adjustment: percentage-based investing. The $150 monthly index fund contribution had been fine when his income was smaller. Now, it was too conservative. Instead of a fixed number, he switched to a percentage-based contribution, 10% of his monthly income, no matter the amount. That meant some months the transfer might be $400 or more. His investment platform made the change easy, just a toggle from fixed to percentage. Third adjustment: raise the overflow sweep threshold. Lifestyle creep often hides an overflow, that extra cash sitting in checking before it's swept away. Dan increased his checking buffer from $2,500 to $3,000, but paired it with a more aggressive sweep, any amount above that would now go directly into investments rather than savings. Why? Because he'd realized something about himself. Once savings reached a certain level, he was more likely to justify pulling from it. Investments, on the other hand, felt untouchable. After making the changes, he sat back in his chair, staring out the kitchen window at the slow sway of tree branches. He felt something unusual, not guilt about the extra lattes or the artisan cheese, but gratitude. Gratitude that he'd caught the pattern early, before it hollowed out the progress he'd worked for. A week later, the next client payment came in. The new rules triggered automatically. $1,500 to savings. 10% to investments. Overflow sweep at months, and directly to his brokerage account. The best part? He didn't have to manually move a single dollar. The true test came a month later, when his friends invited him to join them for a concert weekend in Chicago. Tickets, hotel, food. It would be another $800. In the past, that would have come from whatever's in checking. Now, the fun money account, replenished slowly but steadily, had just over $900. He said yes immediately, without touching his savings or investments. On the flight home from Chicago, sitting by the window as the city's lights disappeared below, Dan thought about how automation had changed not just his finances, but his default reactions. When income rose, the system absorbed the gain automatically. When opportunities came up, the system made it clear what he could spend. And when lifestyle creep tried to sneak in, the system shut the door before it got too comfortable. By the end of the San Francisco project, his numbers looked different. Savings, $23,210. Investments, $41,720. Fund money, $540. And checking? Still right around $3,000, as designed. He poured himself a glass of water, leaned on the balcony railing, and let the evening breeze wash over him. Below, the street was alive with quiet city sounds. A bus rumbling past, a couple laughing as they walked, the distant hum of a street performer's guitar. He realized something important. Financial growth wasn't about resisting every upgrade in life. It was about designing for upgrades without losing momentum. He didn't need to live like a monk to reach his goals. He could enjoy good coffee, take trips, buy better headphones, as long as the system got paid first. And with that, lifestyle creep wasn't an enemy anymore. It was just another variable the system could handle. It began with a cough. Nothing dramatic. Just a scratchy tickle in the back of his throat that refused to go away. At first, Dan ignored it. He had deadlines, calls, errands. He told himself it was seasonal allergies, or maybe the dry air from the new AC system in the co-working space. But over the next week, the cough deepened. The tickle became pressure. The pressure became fatigue. One Friday morning, after waking up drenched in sweat, he finally called his doctor. The clinic was busy, the waiting room filled with the low hum of coughs and rustling magazines. Dan sat near the window, his laptop balanced on his knees. He tried to answer emails, but found himself rereading the same sentences, unable to focus. When the nurse finally called his name, he followed her into the exam room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. "You've got pneumonia," the doctor said, glancing at his chest x-ray on the screen. "Nothing severe, but you'll need antibiotics and a few days of real rest." Rest. A foreign concept lately. Dan filled the prescription on the way home. $78 out of pocket. Not bad. But the doctor also ordered follow-up imaging in 2 weeks to make sure the infection cleared. And that's when things got more expensive. 2 days later, the bill for the x-ray arrived. $620. Insurance had covered part, but not all. The old Dan might have panicked. He would have started mentally shuffling bills, maybe delaying a payment, maybe pulling from whatever savings he had, if there was any at all. But now, he opened his laptop and pulled up his tracker. Checking, $3,024. Buffer, $3,000. Savings, $23,210. Investments, $41,720. Emergency fund, inside savings, $6,000. He exhaled slowly. The bill wasn't good news, but it wasn't a crisis. Not anymore. He decided to handle it systematically, the way his automation plan had taught him. Check the emergency fund, fully intact. Review upcoming bills, all auto-pays scheduled and covered by checking. Decide whether this was a true emergency or could be absorbed by buffer plus fund money. The x-ray bill fell into a gray area. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was outside normal monthly expenses. He decided to split it, $300 from the emergency fund, $320 from checkings overflow. The payment went out that afternoon. He didn't feel the dread he used to feel when sending large sums away. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction in watching the plan work, like testing a parachute and finding it opened exactly as designed. For the next week, Dan worked from his couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, the city sounds muffled by the closed windows. His laptop rested on a pillow, a cup of tea steaming beside him. The automation system carried on without him. Rent auto paid on the 1st. Savings transfer of $1,500 completed. Investment contribution triggered on the 20th. He barely touched his accounts. He didn't need to. When the follow-up imaging came, the news was good. The infection had cleared completely. The second bill was smaller, $220, and this time, he paid it from the overflow sweep without touching the emergency fund. That Saturday, feeling more like himself, he met his sister, Claire, for lunch. She noticed he looked healthier. "Guess you had a rough couple weeks," she said. "Yeah," he admitted. "And it wasn't cheap. But it didn't wreck me." "How's that?" "Automation," he said simply. "Everything's set up so the money I need is already in place. I don't have to scramble when life throws something at me." She raised an eyebrow. "I could use some of that." He smiled. "We'll talk after dessert." The conversation stuck with him. A year ago, he wouldn't have been able to explain how his system worked without pulling out spreadsheets and boring his audience. Now, he realized it was simpler. The system existed so that unexpected expenses didn't derail everything else. It didn't make emergencies go away. It just made them manageable. That night, back in his apartment, Dan sat on the couch with his tracker open. The emergency fund was now at $5,700 instead of $6,000, but that was fine. He set a new rule. Each month, $100 from overflow sweeps would rebuild it until it hit $6,000 again. He also added a new line to his plan, medical reserve, $25 per month into a separate subaccount, small enough not to notice, big enough to cover the copays and out-of-pocket costs that insurance didn't touch. For the next month, Dan found himself reflecting on the pneumonia episode more than he expected. It wasn't just about the bill. It was about the mental space he'd had during recovery. He hadn't once stayed up at night worrying about how to pay for treatment. He hadn't delayed care to wait until next payday. He hadn't felt the guilt of pulling money from savings meant for something else. He realized that in a way, his automation system had given him something most people didn't think about until it was gone: the freedom to get sick without financial panic. 3 months later, the emergency fund was fully restored. The medical reserve was at $75, and his savings and investments had both continued their steady climb, untouched by the disruption. Dan looked at the tracker, then closed the laptop. Outside, the city was buzzing, the sound of a bus braking, people laughing at the cafe across the street, the faint thump of music from somewhere down the block. He thought about the cough, the bills, the quiet afternoons on the couch. Automation hadn't just protected his money. It had protected his recovery. It began as a passing thought on a Sunday morning. Dan was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring the last of the coffee from his French press into a chipped white mug. Outside, the early autumn sun stretched long shadows across the quiet street. A breeze rattled the yellowing leaves on the big sycamore tree that leaned over his apartment building's front steps. The thought came as he took his first sip. Maybe it's time to buy a place. Not because he disliked the apartment. He actually loved it. The rent was fair, the neighborhood was safe, and the third-floor balcony gave him the perfect angle on sunsets over the city skyline. But something about the past few months had planted the idea in his head. He wasn't sure if it was the quiet confidence of having an emergency fund and a healthy investment account, or maybe just the slow, steady increase in housing prices he'd noticed every time he walked past the realtor's window down the block. Later that afternoon, he met Claire, his sister, for lunch at a cafe near the river. They grabbed a table outside, the kind with a wobble that forced him to wedge a folded napkin under one leg. "So," she said, tearing a piece of bread from the basket between them, "when are you buying a house?" Dan laughed. "Funny you should mention it. I was just thinking about it this morning." Claire grinned. "You've been renting forever. Don't you want to build some equity?" "Sure," he said, "but I also like the flexibility. If work shifts or I want to move, no mortgage tie me down." She shrugged. "You're not wrong. But interest rates are still decent, and prices aren't going to magically drop. Dan leaned back in his chair, squinting toward the water. If I did it, I'd have to make sure it didn't wreck my system. The automation keeps everything running. I don't want to break it just to get a set of house keys. That night, he sat at his desk with the glow of his laptop washing over him, pulling up his tracker. The three big numbers were steady. Checking, $3,004. Savings, $23,210. Investments, $42,300. He opened a blank page and typed at the top, home purchase feasibility. Then, line by line, he started outlining the factors. 1. How much house could he afford without breaking the system? Old Dan would have answered this by seeing the mortgage pre-approval number from a bank and thinking, if they say I can borrow $400,000, I can afford $400,000. But he knew better now. Affordability wasn't about what the bank said. It was about what fit into his automation without compromising the savings rate or investment contributions. He pulled up a mortgage calculator and ran a scenario for a $300,000 condo with 20% down. That meant $60,000 up front, far more than his savings balance. Even if he pulled from investments, which he didn't want to do, it would wipe out the emergency fund. Too much, he thought. Let's start smaller. A $200,000 property with 20% down would require $40,000 up front. That still meant building savings for at least another year while maintaining his other goals. 2. How would monthly cost change? His rent was $1,250. If he bought a place, the mortgage on a $160,000 loan at 5.5% would be around $900. Sounds good until you add property taxes, insurance, maintenance, HOA fees. That could push it to $1,400 or more, higher than his current rent. Still manageable, but only if automation kept flowing exactly as it did now. 3. Could automation handle it? Dan started to imagine the system with a mortgage. Rent autopay replaced by mortgage autopay from checking. Utilities, internet, and subscriptions still hitting the credit cards. Savings and investment transfers still happening on schedule. Overflow sweeps still active. But here was the catch. The emergency fund needed to be bigger. A homeowner couldn't skate by with $6,000 for emergencies. A new roof or HVAC failure could swallow that in one gulp. He made a note. Emergency fund target if buying equals $15,000. 4. Timeline to readiness. With his current surplus, he could add $1,000 a month to savings while still investing. That meant he could reach $40,000 in savings in roughly 17 months, enough for the down payment and a boosted emergency fund. The numbers gave him clarity. He didn't need to decide today. He didn't need to rush. Buying now would be possible, but not optimal. Waiting meant walking into the purchase without touching investments, without shrinking the safety net, and without breaking the system. The next week, he met with a financial planner, a recommendation from a client, just to get a second opinion. The planner, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and a knack for scribbling clear diagrams on legal pads, listened as Dan described his automation setup. Impressive, she said. You've built what I wish more of my clients had. The challenge now is scaling it up to handle homeownership. Dan leaned forward. So you're saying wait? I'm saying prepare, she said. Keep your down payment in a high-yield savings account. Grow your emergency fund. And when the time comes, your system will barely notice the transition. That night, Dan sat on his balcony as the sky deepened to navy blue, the streetlights flickering on below. He thought about the idea of owning, the pride, the permanence, the responsibility. He also thought about how much he valued the feeling of financial security he had now. How he could take a trip, pay a surprise bill, or even get sick without losing momentum. The decision crystallized. He would wait. But waiting didn't mean doing nothing. It meant setting the system up for that future step, so when the day came, it would feel like just another automated transfer. Over the next week, he made 3 changes to the plan. Created a home fund, a separate high-yield savings account, $1,000 per month automatically deposited from overflow sweeps and surplus. Boosted the emergency fund contribution to $200 per month. Labeled all investment contributions as non-negotiable in his tracker, a reminder that even when buying, he wouldn't pause them. By the end of the month, the tracker had a new section. Home fund, $1,000. Emergency fund, $6,200. Goal, $15,000. Investments, $43,010. It didn't look like much yet. But the beauty of the system was that he didn't have to obsess over it. The growth would happen whether he checked it daily or forgot about it for weeks. One crisp morning in late October, Dan walked past the realtor's office on his way to the co-working space. In the window was a listing for a one-bedroom loft, exposed brick, high ceilings, walking distance to the river. Price, $210,000. The old Dan would have stopped, stared, maybe even called a number on the flyer. The new Dan kept walking, smiling to himself. He'd be ready for something like that soon enough, but on his terms. That night, as he closed his laptop and turned off the kitchen light, he realized something important. The system wasn't just about making life easier now. It was about making big decisions without fear. And when the time came to buy, it wouldn't feel like a gamble. It would feel like the next logical step. The offer came on a Tuesday afternoon. Dan was in the co-working space, headphones on, a spreadsheet open on his laptop. A tap on the shoulder broke his concentration. It was Amelia, a project manager from a tech firm he'd worked with last year. "You busy for the next few months?" she asked, a knowing smile on her face. "Define busy," he said, sliding the headphones down around his neck. She laughed. "We've got a big client in Toronto. They need someone on-site for 3 months. Housing's covered. Travel covered. Pay is well, you'll like it." That night, Dan sat at his kitchen table, the offer sheet spread out in front of him. It was good money. Really good. The kind of project that not only paid well, but also came with new connections and potential follow-up work. But it meant leaving town for 12 weeks. And for someone who had once managed his money with a mix of sticky notes and panicked late-night logins to his bank account, that thought carried a faint chill. Could the system actually run without me? He opened his laptop and looked at his tracker. Checking, $3,010. Savings, $24,240. Investments, $43,950. Home fund, $3,000. Emergency fund, $6,600. Every line was steady, every graph rising like a gentle slope toward a distant summit. The automation rules were set: transfers to savings and investments, bill auto-pays, overflow sweeps. But 3 months was a long time not to touch anything. He decided to treat it like a stress test, only this time the stress would be absence. If the system could operate untouched for 3 months, he knew it was truly bulletproof. Preparation phase. The week before departure, Dan went through each automation rule. Rent autopay would run from checking on the first of each month. Good. Utilities and internet, set to autopay via credit card, which autopaid from checking. Good. Subscriptions, Netflix, Spotify, cloud storage, all covered by card autopay. Good. Savings transfer, $1,500 on the first. Investment contribution, 10% of monthly income on the 20th. Overflow sweep, anything above $3,000 in checking at months and swept to home fund. Next, he created a travel buffer. He moved an extra $500 into checking as a cushion for unexpected expenses while abroad. Not because he planned to use it, just in case something in the system went slightly off. He also set up email alerts for any transaction over $500 and for any account balance dropping below set thresholds. That way, even from a hotel room in Toronto, he could see problems before they became problems. Departure. The morning of his flight, Dan stood in his apartment, scanning the rooms one last time. Plants watered. Mail forwarded to Claire. Laptop and chargers in the backpack. He locked the door, pulled his suitcase down the hall, and felt a strange mix of excitement and curiosity. He wasn't just wondering how the job would go. He was wondering what it would be like to live 3 months without manually moving money around. Toronto. The first week was a blur of onboarding, client meetings, and learning the quirks of the new office. His housing was a furnished one-bedroom apartment on the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a stretch of the city's financial district, and at night the lights glittered like constellations. Dan slipped into a routine. Work during the day. Evenings exploring, streetcar rides to new neighborhoods, sampling unfamiliar restaurants, long walks along the lakefront when the weather was clear. Money-wise, everything ticked along quietly. Rent at home autopaid. The savings transfer hit on schedule. The investment contribution went through on the 20th. Month 1 check-in. On the last day of the first month, an email alert pinged. Overflow sweep triggered. $480 transfer to home fund. Dan smiled. Even with the travel buffer and checking, his expenses were so consistent that the sweep had still moved money to the goal account. He opened his tracker. Checking. $3,002. Savings. $25,740. Investments. $44,890. Home fund. $3,480. Emergency fund. $6,600. The numbers told him the system didn't care if he was in his apartment or 500 miles away. It simply worked. The mid-trip test. Halfway through the contract, a surprise expense landed. Not for him, but for his apartment back home. The building manager emailed to say the water heater in the unit needed replacing. His share of the cost, $320. In the past, this would have been a scramble. But now, the bill hit his credit card. The credit card auto-paid from checking. The buffer absorbed it without touching savings. The system had passed another small test without breaking stride. Month 2 check-in. The second month's sweep was bigger, $690 to the home fund. Dan realized that with his housing covered in Toronto, his spending had dropped dramatically. More overflow meant faster progress toward his down payment goal. Life outside the dashboard. One of the most surprising things about the trip was how little mental energy money took up now. In the old days, travel meant daily budget checks, receipt stacks, and the creeping anxiety of, am I spending too much? Now, his days were filled with work challenges, evening adventures, and new friendships, not financial calculations. He'd automated his way into what felt like financial invisibility. Final month. As the project wound down, Dan spent a quiet Saturday morning at a coffee shop overlooking the lake. He opened his tracker for the first time in weeks. Checking. $3,010. Savings. $28,740. Investments. $46,220. Home fund. $5,020. Emergency fund. $6,600. 3 months away, and every category had grown. The system hadn't just survived his absence. It had thrived. Back home in his apartment, unpacking his suitcase, Dan thought about the trip. Professionally, it had been a win. Personally, it had been a reminder. He didn't need to hover over his accounts to stay in control. He'd built something that could run without him, a financial autopilot. And now, he trusted it more than ever. It started with a smell. Not the burnt toast kind that makes you worry, but that rich, intoxicating scent of brand new leather baking gently in the afternoon sun. Dan wasn't in the market for a car. At least, not in the conscious, scrolling through dealer websites kind of way. His old Honda Civic, a 2011 model with just over 140,000 miles, was still running like a stubborn, loyal workhorse. It had been with him through cross-country moves, weekend camping trips, and more late-night grocery runs than he could count. But the Civic had its quirks. The AC was a little weak in summer. The paint had faded in spots. And the Bluetooth connection worked only when it felt like it. One Tuesday, after a morning meeting downtown, he walked past a glassy car dealership on his way to grab lunch. Inside, rows of gleaming vehicles sat like jewels under showroom lighting. And that's when the smell hit him, a mix of leather, polish, and promise. He told himself he was just looking. 5 minutes wouldn't hurt. Inside, a salesman with a perfect smile and a navy blazer approached. Beautiful day to be car shopping, the man said. Just browsing, Dan replied, his hands in his pockets. Of course, the salesman said, as though he'd heard that exact phrase 1,000 times and knew it was only partly true. What do you drive now? A Civic, Dan said. Old, but reliable. Reliable is good, the salesman said, leading him toward a low, sleek sedan with a dashboard that looked more like a spaceship cockpit. But comfortable and reliable? That's better. 15 minutes later, Dan was behind the wheel of a test car, a 2023 hybrid sedan with a quiet hum instead of an engine growl. The seats hugged him in all the right places. The AC could probably refrigerate a small room. And the dashboard was a work of art. When they returned to the lot, the salesman slid a piece of paper across the desk. The monthly payment was high, but not out of reach. In fact, by the numbers, Dan could afford it easily. That was the danger. That evening, Dan sat at his kitchen table, the paper folded neatly in front of him. He stared at the number. The salesman had even highlighted it in yellow, as though to say, "This is all you need to see." He opened his laptop and pulled up his tracker. Checking, $3,010. Savings, $28,740. Investments, $46,220. Home fund, $5,020. Emergency fund, $6,600. The monthly payment would fit in without touching the savings rate or the investment contributions, but it would reduce the overflow. And overflow was how the home fund grew fastest. He thought about his Civic, parked quietly downstairs in its usual spot. It was paid off. It was insured cheaply. Repairs, when needed, were manageable. The upgrade would be nice, sure, but nice wasn't the same as necessary. Dan remembered something his father once told him when he was younger and eyeing a fancier guitar than he could afford. You can't measure the value of a thing by whether you can buy it. You measure it by what you give up to have it. That was the crux of it. Buying the new car wouldn't hurt him financially, but it would slow his progress toward the house. And right now, the house was the bigger dream. The next morning, he decided to run a want versus want more test. He opened a blank page on his laptop and wrote 2 lists. Want, comfortable seats. New tech, hybrid efficiency. That new car smell. Want more, buying a home without touching investments. Keeping emergency fund above $15,000 as a homeowner. Reaching $50,000 in investments before 45. Spending without stress on travel or family. When he looked at the list side by side, the answer was obvious. Still, temptation doesn't vanish just because you make a logical choice. For the next week, the thought of the new car hovered like the smell of strong coffee in another room. He'd pass by other drivers in sleek hybrids and feel a small pang. He even found himself browsing reviews late at night. But each time, he came back to the system. The system was built to make big goals inevitable, unless he started sabotaging it with smaller, shinier goals. One Friday evening, his friend Jordan dropped by. Jordan was a car guy, the kind who could name an engine by the sound alone. "You're really not going for it?" Jordan asked when Dan explained the decision. "Nope," Dan said. "Not yet. Man, you've got the money. Live a little." Dan laughed. "I am living, just not in a way that kills the long game." Jordan shook his head, grinning. "You've turned into one of those spreadsheet monks." "Maybe," Dan said. "But monk or not, I'll be in my own place in a couple years. You can park your new ride in my driveway." 2 weeks later, Dan took the Civic in for an oil change. The mechanic mentioned the brakes might need replacing in 6 months. The estimate? About $350. Dan almost laughed. That was it. That was the cost of not upgrading. He scheduled the brake replacement for spring and left the shop with the same sense of relief he'd felt when walking out of the dealership empty-handed. By the end of the month, the overflow sweep moved $740 in the home fund. That number was higher than usual, and Dan knew exactly why. No new car payment. The home fund total, $5,760. Just a few months earlier, it had been zero. One night, sitting on his balcony, Dan thought about how easy it would have been to say yes to the car. To walk into the dealership, sign the papers, and drive off with the smell of new leather filling the cabin. But easy wasn't always smart. And the truth was, discipline didn't feel like deprivation anymore. It felt like choosing the bigger one over the quick thrill. A week later, he passed the dealership again. This time, he didn't even glance inside. It was the second week of December when Dan's phone buzzed with a message from his oldest friend, Marcus. "Hey, you got a minute? Need to talk about something important." The words carried a weight Dan could feel even before he hit call. Marcus wasn't the type to dress up small talk with the word important. They'd known each other since high school, back when Dan was just learning to drive and Marcus had a part-time job at the pizza shop near their bus stop. The call connected, and Marcus's voice came through low and tight. "Hey man, I hate to ask this, but I'm in a bit of a mess." Dan leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of mess?" "A money one," Marcus said. "I'm short on rent this month. Been short the last 2, actually. I've been juggling stuff, but it's catching up to me. If I don't figure it out, I'm going to be in real trouble." The ask. Dan's mind flicked immediately to the obvious possibility. Marcus wanted to borrow money. That was the oldest move in the book between friends, and also the fastest way to test, or destroy, a friendship. How short are we talking? Dan asked. Marcus hesitated. About $1,000. But honestly, that's just to get even for now. I'm upside down every month lately. I thought I'd catch up, but it's like the bills keep multiplying. Dan didn't answer right away. He knew Marcus. Generous to a fault. Quick to pick up the tab. Always saying yes when people needed help moving, babysitting, lending tools, you name it. But numbers? Budgets? Those had never been Marcus's strengths. Finally, Dan said, "Okay, but if I help you, it's not going to be just a handout or a loan. You're going to have to let me help you fix the whole situation. And you've got to be all in." Marcus gave a dry laugh. At this point, I'll try anything. The meeting. They met 2 nights later at Dan's apartment. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon from a candle on the counter. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the street in a thin white layer. Marcus arrived bundled in his heavy parka, cheeks flushed from the cold. He kicked off his boots and flopped onto the couch. Dan placed 2 mugs of coffee on the table, then opened his laptop. "All right. First, we've got to see the damage." Marcus winced. "You really want to look at all of it?" "Every penny," Dan said. "We can't fix what we can't see." Step 1, the ugly truth. They started with Marcus's checking account. His balance was $312. Savings? 0. Credit card 1. For $1,280 balance at 19% interest. Credit card 2. $2,940 at 22% interest. Auto loan. $8,500 remaining. Dan whistled softly. "Okay. First rule, no shame. This is just data, and data can be changed." Marcus nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the coffee mug. Step 2, the reality check. "Walk me through a month," Dan said. Marcus explained that his rent was $1,200, car payment $310, utilities about $200, food roughly $500, plus other stuff, gas, streaming, nights out. His income after taxes was $3,000. On paper, it should have worked. In practice, it didn't. The other stuff added up fast. An unplanned dinner here, a subscription he'd forgotten about there. He'd been plugging gaps with credit cards, which only made the next month worse. Dan leaned forward. "All right, I've got an idea. We're going to automate your finances like mine. But we'll do it in steps, and we'll set it up so it runs without you having to micromanage every dollar. You okay with that?" Marcus shrugged. "If it works, I'm in." Step 3, the framework. Dan grabbed a notepad and started drawing boxes. "Here's how it'll work. Your income hits checking. On payday, a fixed amount goes to savings automatically, even if it's small at first. Bills get auto-paid from checking on set dates. You use one credit card for fixed expenses, another for variable, both auto-paid in full. At month's end, anything above a set buffer in checking sweeps into savings or debt payoff." Marcus squinted. "That sounds like a lot of moving parts." "That's the point," Dan said. "It moves without you moving it. Your job will be to not mess with the flow once it's set." The setup session. They spent 2 hours connecting Marcus's accounts to an online budget tracker. They listed every bill, subscription, and irregular expense. Marcus was shocked to find he was paying for a gym he hadn't visited in 8 months and 3 streaming services he barely used. "Cancel these," Dan said, clicking with precision. "That's $65 a month back in your pocket." They set a checking account buffer of $1,000. Anything above that at the end of the month would split 70% to debt payoff, 30% to savings. The first win. By the time Marcus left that night, he wasn't debt-free, but he was clear on exactly where every dollar would go next month. Dan also gave him a condition. No extra spending for 30 days without checking the tracker first. 3 weeks later, Marcus texted, "Dude, my checking balance is actually going up." "Told you," Dan replied. The turning point. By the 3rd month, Marcus's overflow sweeps had paid down $1,100 of his highest interest card. His savings had reached $400. Not huge, but the momentum was there. They met again to review progress, sitting at the same table with fresh mugs of coffee. "You're in the green now," Dan said, scrolling through the tracker. "Stay the course, And in 9 months, you'll have one card gone and $2,000 saved. Marcus sat back, shaking his head. All this time, I thought I had an income problem. Turns out I had a system problem. The friendship shift. Helping Marcus hadn't strained the friendship the way a simple loan would have. Instead of feeling like Dan was rescuing him, Marcus felt like he was learning. There was pride in it. He'd text small wins, paid the electric bill early, or skipped takeout, cooked at home, and Dan would send back a simple nice work. The real breakthrough came 6 months in. Marcus called one afternoon, excitement in his voice. I just paid off the first credit card. Dan smiled into the phone. That's the system at work. Why it worked? It wasn't magic. It was automation doing the heavy lifting, removing the need for Marcus to make constant decisions about money. The bills paid themselves. The savings happened automatically. The overflow sweeps felt like a bonus, even though they were just the result of controlled spending. And maybe most importantly, Marcus wasn't relying on Dan for constant handouts. He was relying on his own system. Epilogue to the episode. A year later, Marcus was debt-free except for his car. His savings sat at $6,500. He still lived in the same apartment, drove the same car, and, to Dan's mild amusement, still complained about his landlord. But the panic was gone from his voice. One night, as they sat on Dan's balcony watching the city lights, Marcus lifted his beer in a small toast. "Thanks for not just bailing me out," he said. Dan raised his own bottle. "Thanks for letting me turn you into a spreadsheet monk." They laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from old friendship and shared victory. It began as a quiet itch at the back of Dan's mind, the kind that sneaks in while you're doing something completely unrelated. He'd been walking home from the co-working space on a late spring evening, warm air brushing against his face, the smell of lilacs from a neighbor's garden drifting over the sidewalk. Somewhere between the glow of a corner cafe and the muted hum of passing traffic, the thought formed fully. What if there was a way to add another income stream without disturbing the system he'd built? The idea wasn't about greed or some restless desire to chase every dollar. His automation was humming along beautifully, his savings and investments growing month after month, the home fund swelling with each overflow sweep. But there was a part of him, maybe the same part that had driven him to streamline his finances in the first place, that wondered how much more resilient the system could become if it had another steady input. The numbers already told a good story, but what if they could tell an even better one? When he got home, he didn't rush to the laptop. He let the idea simmer, poured himself a glass of water, and stood by the balcony, looking down at the street 3 floors below. The sky was a shade between peach and blue, the kind of color you only see for a few minutes before night takes over. He thought about what a side hustle really meant. Not just extra income, but extra complexity. Would it risk throwing off the balance? Could he automate that, too? The next day, over lunch with his friend Sarah, he floated the idea. Sarah ran a small graphic design business on the side of her full-time job and had managed to make it a consistent, low-stress part of her life. She leaned back in her chair, stirring her iced tea with a straw, and gave him a look that was equal parts curiosity and caution. "You've got the most low-maintenance system of anyone I know," she said. "You need to make sure whatever you pick can either be automated or fit seamlessly into your routine. Otherwise, you're just giving yourself another job." "That's the goal," Dan said. "No late nights, no chasing clients, no crazy deadlines. Just something that flows." They talked through possibilities. Consulting in his industry could pay well, but it came with unpredictable schedules. Online courses? Possible, but would require a lot of upfront work. Eventually, Sarah mentioned something he hadn't considered: digital products, templates, guides, resources people could buy without him having to fulfill orders manually. That night, Dan sat at his kitchen table with the soft hum of the fridge behind him, a blank notebook open in front of him. He started jotting down ideas for things he could create once, then sell repeatedly. The first few ideas were bad, even he could tell. But a few pages in, he hit something interesting: a budgeting spreadsheet modeled after his own automation system. Not just a spreadsheet, but a step-by-step setup guide embedded inside it. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. It wasn't just another product. It was a way of teaching the very thing that had changed his own life. And because it was built in a format people could download instantly, there'd be no ongoing work beyond occasional updates. It would be an extension of his philosophy: build once, let run. Over the next 2 weeks, he spent early mornings refining the template before his regular workday began. He'd sit in the golden light streaming through his kitchen window, coffee steaming in the mug beside him, adjusting cell colors, writing instructions that were clear but not overwhelming. He wanted it to feel like more than a spreadsheet, more like a mini financial dashboard for anyone who used it. When it was finally ready, he created a simple page on a digital marketplace, uploaded the file, wrote a short description, and set the price at $20. His expectations were low. This was an experiment, not a guaranteed win. The first sale came 3 days later. It was a small notification on his phone while he was in line at the grocery store, a barely noticeable ping. But seeing that a stranger had paid money for something he created gave him an unexpected jolt of energy. He smiled quietly and put his phone back in his pocket. By the end of the first month, he'd sold 8 copies. Not life-changing money, but about $160 he hadn't had before. More importantly, he'd spent 0 extra hours delivering it. The system was already automated, payments processed, files delivered instantly. The only thing he had to do was check the monthly sales report, which had quickly become one of his favorite little rituals. The next step was deciding what to do with the income. It was tempting to let it disappear into everyday spending, but that would defeat the purpose. Instead, he created a new automation rule. Every dollar from side hustle sales would split evenly, half to the home fund, half to investments. It wasn't enough to make a dramatic change overnight, but over time, he knew it would layer another steady input into the system's growth. 3 months in, sales had risen to about 20 copies a month, bringing in $400. Again, not huge, but steady. That was the key word, steady. He realized he'd stumbled into the rare kind of side hustle that didn't feel like work at all once it was set up. One Saturday morning, while walking through the farmer's market with a bag of fresh bread tucked under his arm, Dan's phone buzzed again. Another sale. He stopped for a moment, looking at the rows of flowers in front of vendor's stall, and thought about how strange it was to be making money while doing something as simple as picking out tomatoes. He wasn't chasing the side hustle. He wasn't obsessively checking numbers. The sales were just there, flowing in like interest on a savings account, small and consistent. By summer's end, the extra income had added nearly $1,200 to his home fund and another $1,200 to his investments. Those numbers might not have impressed someone measuring success only in big jumps, but Dan knew better. Every dollar was a brick in the wall he was building between himself and financial insecurity. The real victory wasn't just in the money. It was in proving to himself that he could expand without losing balance. He'd added a new stream without dismantling the old ones, proving the system was flexible enough to grow. On a late August evening, he sat on his balcony with a glass of cold water, watching the last pink traces of sunset fade from the sky. Somewhere below, a couple laughed as they passed on the sidewalk. He thought about the first moment the idea of a side hustle had crossed his mind, how cautious he'd felt about disrupting what worked. Now, looking at the numbers, the sales reports, and the calm way it all fit into his life, he knew the caution had been the right instinct. The trick wasn't to chase every new opportunity. The trick was to choose only the ones that could be set in motion and left alone, the way his financial automation worked from the very beginning. Build once, let run. Another sale pinged on his phone. He didn't even open it right away. He just smiled into the warm night air and took another sip of water. The first sign was the cold. Not the sharp, invigorating kind that bites at your cheeks when you step outside, but a creeping chill that made its way into the apartment without permission. Dan noticed it one evening in late November, the kind of night when the wind outside rattled the window panes and sent dead leaves skittering across the sidewalks. He was sitting at his desk, reading over a project draft, when he felt it, a slow, steady drop in temperature that made him pull his sweater tighter. At first, he thought maybe the heat just hadn't kicked in yet, but when he checked the thermostat, it glowed back at him with a number far lower than it should have been. The heat was on, at least according to the display, but the air pushing out from the vents was lukewarm, barely above room temperature. He spent the next hour checking the obvious things. Thermostat settings, breaker switches, filters. Everything looked fine, except for the fact that it very clearly wasn't. The next morning, after a restless night under 2 extra blankets, Dan called the building maintenance office. The manager's voice was apologetic but firm. We've been getting a few calls like yours. Looks like the main furnace is on its last legs. We're trying to get someone in today, but parts are going to be an issue. These older models aren't exactly off the shelf anymore. Dan asked the question he already knew the answer to. Is this going to be expensive? Unfortunately, yes. We're looking at replacing it entirely. The cost will be split among the units. You'll get your share on the bill. By late afternoon, a repair crew had confirmed the worst. The furnace was beyond repair. The total replacement cost, divided evenly, came at $2,150 per unit. For a moment, Dan felt that old, familiar twinge in his chest. The one he used to get years ago when unexpected expenses threatened to knock over his carefully stacked plans. In the past, this would have meant weeks of recalculating, shuffling money from one envelope to another, maybe even putting it on a credit card and hoping to chip away at it slowly. But now he just logged into his account. The emergency fund sat there, a quiet line item that he rarely thought about, but always valued. $6,600, untouched for months. It existed for this exact purpose, expenses that were both urgent and unavoidable. He felt a strange calm as he transferred $2,200 to checking, rounding up slightly just to be safe. The bill came 2 days later. He paid it immediately. There was no stress, no bargaining with himself over which goal to sacrifice. The automation kept everything else running. Savings still got its transfer on the 1st. Investments still pulled their percentage on the 20th. Overflow still swept into the home fund at month's end. But the furnace replacement wasn't the only thing the winter had in store. A week later, a storm rolled in from the north, the kind that moved slowly enough for the weather apps to issue warnings days in advance, but still carried an edge of unpredictability. The sky turned the color of dull steel, and the wind began to howl in the kind of sustained gusts that make you worry about things you can't see. Dan was in the kitchen making tea when the power went out. Everything fell silent except for the wind battering the building. He stood there in the dim light from the window, watching the last of the steam curl from the kettle. The outage lasted the rest of the afternoon. By evening, the temperature in the apartment had dropped again, and he layered up: thermal shirt, sweater, wool socks. He lit a couple of candles and pulled a blanket over his lap while he read on the couch. At around 8, the lights flickered back on, along with the hum of the new furnace. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. When he checked his phone, there was a new message from his insurance company. Claim alert. Storm damage to property in your area. Please inspect your unit and report any issues within 48 hours. Dan stepped out onto the balcony, the cold biting at his face. The railing was slick with freezing rain, and below, the parking lot glistened under the streetlights. His Civic sat under a thin layer of ice, but otherwise seemed fine. It wasn't until he looked up that he saw it. A section of the building's roof had peeled back, exposing part of the upper floor to the elements. He lived one floor down from the top, but water damage was a possibility. The next morning, maintenance confirmed that several units had taken on water. Repairs would be covered by insurance, but residents would need to cover their deductibles. For Dan, that meant another $750. He didn't even flinch. The emergency fund, slightly lighter from the furnace replacement, still had plenty left. He transferred the money without hesitation. What struck him most wasn't that he could cover both expenses. It was that his system made these moments feel ordinary. In the past, they would have been disruptive events, knocking him off course for months. Now they were just transactions, absorbed into the flow without breaking stride. That weekend, as the wind died down and the sky cleared, Dan walked to the cafe around the corner. He sat by the window, sipping a cappuccino, watching the pale winter sun glint off the icy sidewalks. He thought about how emergencies used to leave him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way that wasn't just about money. There was always that fear lurking in the background, that one bad month could undo everything. Automation hadn't just grown his savings and investments. It had built a kind of financial insulation, a buffer between him and the chaos that life occasionally threw his way. It let him make decisions from a place of calm instead of panic. The furnace and the storm had been reminders. Not that bad things happen. He already knew that, but that he could handle them without compromising his long-term goals. The home fund was still growing. The investments were still compounding. The savings account would refill over the next few months without him even thinking about it. Back at his apartment, he logged into his tracker one more time. The graphs dipped slightly where the emergency fund had been tapped, then continued their steady upward slope. He imagined that slope stretching forward, through winters yet to come, carrying him toward the life he was building, not one free from problems, but one prepared for them. It started with a phone call on a gray Thursday morning in February. Dan was halfway through his second cup of coffee, the one that usually marked the transition from slow waking to focused work mode, when his phone lit up with his sister's name. They didn't talk every day, so his first thought was that something was wrong. But when he answered, her voice was warm, almost bubbling over with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "I just got off the phone with Dad. He wants to do a family trip, like all of us, together, in Italy." Dan leaned back in his chair, letting the words sink in. "Italy? Yeah. Rome, Florence, Venice, the whole thing. He's talking 2 weeks, into June. He says it's his way of celebrating finally retiring. You know how he's been putting it off, forever." He smiled despite himself. Their father had been the kind of man who swore he'd never retire, not because he loved work so much, but because he didn't know who he'd be without it. That he decided to step away was news enough. That he wanted to mark it with a 2-week family trip overseas? That was unexpected. "That sounds incredible," Dan said slowly. "What's the catch?" She laughed. "Well, Dad's covering most of it. Flights, hotels, some of the big tours. But he said we'd each need to cover our own day-to-day stuff. Meals, trains between cities, that sort of thing. He figured it would be more fun if everyone had some skin in the game." Dan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. It made sense. And yet, a familiar, quiet voice inside him started doing math before she even finished the sentence. "When do you need to know?" he asked. "We're booking flights next week." He's got this whole spreadsheet going already. "And Dan, you have to come. It won't be the same without you." He promised he'd think about it, and hung up, the excitement in her voice lingering in his ears like a warm echo. The rest of the day, he found himself drifting. He'd catch a phrase in an email, and his mind would wander to images of narrow cobblestone streets, golden evening lights spilling across ancient buildings, the smell of fresh espresso drifting out of small cafes. He'd never been to Italy. He'd always said he would go someday. But someday hadn't come yet, and now here it was, knocking on his door with a specific date and a family-shaped invitation. That evening, he pulled up his tracker. The home fund had grown to just over $11,000. Savings sat at $28,000. Investments were holding steady. His emergency fund, even after the furnace and storm repairs, had climbed back to $5,400. The logical part of him knew he could afford this trip without jeopardizing anything major. But the system he'd built wasn't just about affording something. It was about protecting the integrity of the plan. Every big expense had to pass through the same mental filter. Will this move me closer to my long-term goals, or pull me further away? That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running the possibilities over in his mind. There were ways to make it work without pulling from the home fund, but they would require breaking one of his unwritten rules: no dismantling the automation for a short-term gain. He could, for example, redirect the overflow sweeps for the next 4 months into a dedicated Italy fund. That would probably cover most of his expenses there without touching savings. But it would slow the home fund's growth, not by much, but enough to notice on the graph. Or he could dip into savings just this once, treat it as a rare exception, and replenish it afterward. But exceptions had a way of breeding more exceptions, and he knew that once he allowed himself to bend the rule, it would be easier to justify bending it again later. The third option, and the one he was almost afraid to admit to himself, was to build a temporary new income stream just for the trip. Something he could spin up quickly, run for a few months, and then shut down without leaving a mess behind. The next day, over coffee with Sarah, he laid it out. She listened without interrupting, then grinned. "So basically, you want to go to Italy without slowing down your home goal or touching your safety net." "Exactly. And you've got what for months?" He nodded. She tapped her mug thoughtfully. "You still have that budgeting template, right? The one that's been selling quietly every month." "Yeah. Brings in a few hundred a month now. What if you double down on that? Maybe create an advanced version, or add a mini course to go with it. Something that makes it feel premium. You could sell it at a higher price for a limited time. Italy Fund Special, or whatever you want to call it." The idea stuck in his mind long after he left the cafe. It had the appeal of not interfering with the core system. The sales could be tracked separately, and every dollar could go straight into the Italy fund. It would also scratch that part of him that liked building things, setting them in motion, and letting them run. The following weekend, he dedicated himself to the project. Mornings were spent refining the template, adding features he'd been meaning to include for months, customizable categories, a built-in net worth tracker, and a year-at-a-glance cash flowchart. Afternoons, he recorded short tutorial videos explaining not just how to use it, but how to think about money in a way that made automation work. By the time he packaged everything together, it felt more like a small product suite than just a spreadsheet. He priced it at $45, more than double the original, but fair for what it offered. He launched it quietly, mentioning it only to his small email list, and posting a link on a couple of forums where people discuss personal finance tools. The first sale came within hours. By the end of the week, he'd made nearly $500. For the next 3 months, the Italy fund grew steadily. Some weeks were better than others, but the momentum held. In early June, when his sister called to finalize the trip details, he checked the account. $2,700. Enough to cover meals, train tickets, museum passes, and even a little room for indulgence. He felt a wave of satisfaction, not just because the numbers worked, but because he'd managed to honor his own rules. The home fund hadn't skipped a beat. Savings was untouched. The emergency fund had even grown by a few $100s. The system was intact, and now had a side note in the ledger. Italy, funded by creativity instead of compromise. On the morning of the flight, he stood in his apartment looking around one last time before locking the door. His carry-on sat by the door, light but efficient, just enough for 2 weeks if he was smart about laundry. His passport was tucked safely into the front pocket of his bag. As he stepped into the hallway, he thought about the quiet work that had made this possible. Not the flurry of last-minute packing or the rush to the airport, but the months of steady, almost invisible action. The automation had kept life running in the background while he built something extra on top. On the plane, as the engines roared and the city lights fell away beneath him, he opened his notebook and jotted a single line. The best goals aren't just protected. They're enhanced by the things you say yes to. He closed the notebook, leaned back, and let himself imagine the cobblestone streets, the evening light, and the first sip of espresso in a cafe that had been there for 100 years. The air in Rome was different from anything Dan had known. It was warm, but not heavy, carrying a subtle mixture of scents: fresh bread from a bakery down the street, exhaust from the small Fiats weaving between buses, the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine spilling over a stone wall. Stepping out of the airport that first afternoon, he had felt the vibration of the city almost before he saw it. Rome seemed to hum, a low steady pulse beneath the chatter of voices and the occasional sharp honk of a car horn. The family's hotel was tucked onto a narrow street, just wide enough for one car at a time, lined with tall, pale buildings whose shutters were thrown open to let the sunlight in. His father had been standing in the small lobby when Dan arrived, grinning in a way Dan hadn't seen in years. Retirement had already softened him, the edges of his voice, the pace of his words, even the way he hugged Dan, holding on for an extra moment. The first evening was a blur of greetings, unpacking, and walking together toward a piazza where restaurant tables spilled into the open space, each one crowned with flickering candles. They ordered pasta and wine, the kind of wine that tasted like it had been made to be paired with conversation. Dan listened as his father and sister told stories from years ago. Some he remembered, some he'd forgotten, all colored by the warm light and the sense that time was stretching in their favor. Over the next few days, they moved through the city like a slow current, taking in the Colosseum under a sky so blue it looked painted, wandering through the Vatican's echoing halls, standing in the Pantheon's great dome as a single beam of sunlight cut through the air. Dan noticed small details. The way street vendors seemed to appear exactly when you wanted a cold drink, how the city seemed to bend and flow around its history instead of building over it, how locals walked without rushing yet still seemed to be everywhere at once. Meals became an unhurried ritual. Mornings began with espresso so strong it seemed to sharpen his thoughts. Afternoons were punctuated by gelato stops. Evenings by long, slow dinners where the bill didn't arrive until you asked for it. His father insisted on covering most of the major costs, but Dan's Italy fund came into play daily. Cappuccinos at corner cafes, train tickets to Florence, museum entries, a pair of leather gloves from a shop whose window display had caught his eye. In Florence, they stayed in a converted townhouse with windows that opened over a narrow lane where scooters buzzed by in the morning and quiet settled in the evening. He walked alone one morning while the others slept, crossing the Ponte Vecchio before the crowds arrived, the river below still and green, the sky beginning to brighten. He stopped halfway across and leaned on the railing, thinking about how far he'd come, not just in miles but in years. There was a time when a trip like this would have felt impossible. Not because of the price tag, exactly, but because of what it would have done to his balance. The old Dan might have swiped a credit card for every coffee and train ticket, telling himself he'd deal with it later, only to find later full of interest charges and regret. Now, every expense here was part of a plan, funded months in advance, without touching the foundation he'd built. That thought alone brought a quiet kind of satisfaction, one that tasted better than any espresso. In Venice, the rhythm changed. The streets gave way to canals, the sound of traffic replaced by the low chug of boat engines and the soft slap of water against stone. They stayed near the Rialto Bridge, and in the evenings Dan would walk down to the edge of the Grand Canal, watching the last light fade behind the domes and bell towers, the water turning the color of old pewter. One night, after a long day of exploring, his sister asked if he ever got tired of thinking about money. The question surprised him. He told her the truth, that he didn't think about it as much as she imagined. The whole point of the system was to not have to think about it all the time. It's like he searched for the right comparison, like putting a boat on the right current. You don't have to row constantly. Just check now and then to make sure you're still heading where you want to go. She laughed softly. Guess that means you're on the right current now. They stood there for a while, watching gondolas drift under the bridge, the city lights shimmering on the water. By the time the trip began to wind down, Dan found himself both reluctant to leave and ready to return. Italy had been a gift, not just a chance to see places he dreamed about, but the reminder that money well managed wasn't about saying no to life. It was about making the yes possible without fear. On their last morning in Venice, he woke early and walked to a small cafe he'd discovered on the second day, ordering one last cappuccino. He took it outside, sipping slowly as he stood by the water's edge, the air cool and damp, the city stirring awake around him. He thought about the notebook entry he'd made on the plane, about how the best goals were enhanced by the things he said yes to. The Italy fund would close when he got home, the extra income stream winding down just as quietly as it had started. But the lesson of it would stay. He'd proven to himself that he could set a short-term goal without compromising the long-term ones, that the system wasn't a cage but a foundation. When they boarded the flight back, he carried no souvenirs except the gloves from Florence and a few postcards he'd bought but never mailed. Everything else, the sound of footsteps on stone streets, the lights spilling over the Arno at sunset, the laughter at long dinners, was stored somewhere else entirely, in a place no expense could ever touch. The plane's descent into his home city felt both abrupt and endless. Italy had been 2 weeks of sound and color, of days blending into each other in the most fluid way, and now the sterile cabin air smelled faintly of recycled coffee and the faint tang of the jet systems. Dan looked out the window as the patchwork of familiar streets came into view, small from this height, the river cutting a silver line through the landscape. By the time he stepped into his apartment later that afternoon, the trip already felt like a vivid dream that had slipped behind a pane of glass. His suitcase sat by the door, unopened. The fridge hummed softly. Outside, the city carried on as if he'd never been gone. He made tea, sat on the couch, and opened his laptop. The numbers greeted him like old friends. The home fund, $11,840. Investments, $47,320. Emergency fund, $5,600. Everything exactly where it should be. His Italy fund account sat at zero now, purpose completed. For a long moment, he just stared at the graphs. It was one thing to know intellectually that his automation worked while he was away. The accounts had continued to grow and transfer money without him. But to see it here, in clean, curved lines, felt like reassurance of a deeper kind. The phone rang, breaking the quiet. The name on the screen made him sit up straighter. It was his old friend Mark. They hadn't spoken in months. Life had a way of creating gaps that neither person meant to leave there, but Mark had been an important figure in Dan's life for years. Someone he'd once split rent with in a small, drafty apartment when they were both just trying to get by. Dan answered, smiling already. "Hey, stranger." Mark's voice was warm, but carried an edge that Dan couldn't place at first. They caught up for a few minutes. Work updates, family news, mutual friends. Then, almost casually, Mark said, "Listen, there's something I need to ask you about. And I hate even bringing it up." Dan felt his shoulders tense. "Go on." Mark hesitated. "I'm in a tight spot. Business has been slow. A couple of invoices didn't come through when they were supposed to. And I'm staring at a rent bill next week that I can't cover. I've got work coming in, but it won't land in time. I hate asking, but could you spot me? Just for a month." The old version of Dan would have answered without thinking, pulling out whatever he had, even if it meant putting himself in a bind. But the old version of Dan had often paid for those choices in ways that went far beyond money. He leaned back, the phone warm against his ear, and let the question hang for a moment. His mind was already moving through the options. The emergency fund wasn't for this. It was for him, for true emergencies in his own life. Pulling from a home fund would break his own rule. And yet, this wasn't a stranger. This was Mark, the guy who'd once covered Dan's share of the electric bill when Dan's freelance check was late. "Mark," he said carefully, "you know I care about you. But I've set up my money in a way where certain accounts aren't meant to be touched unless it's critical. And I can't compromise that system." There was a pause, then a quiet, "Yeah, I figured. Just thought I'd ask." Dan closed his eyes. "Listen, I can't just hand you rent money from my savings. But here's what I can do. I can help you set up something, even in the next few days, that'll get cash flowing fast. The way I did with my Italy fund. It won't be magic, but it'll be something." Mark didn't sound convinced. "You think that's going to help in a week?" "It can, if we make it lean and focused. And I'll walk you through it." The next day, they met at a coffee shop near Mark's apartment. Mark looked tired, not just in his face, but in the way he carried himself, like the weight of the problem had pushed his shoulders forward. They took a table in the corner, laptops out. Dan asked questions, the way he would if he were designing a project for himself. "What skills do you already have? What's the fastest thing you can produce without needing to buy equipment or wait on someone else? What's something people already ask you for?" Mark had done small video edits for local businesses before. He had the software. He could turn projects around fast. By the time they finished their coffees, they had a plan. Mark would offer a 48-hour promo edit package for small businesses. Short, sharp videos for social media. Priced low enough to move quickly, but high enough to matter if he booked several in a week. Dan helped him set up a basic landing page that afternoon, using free tools, with a clean Order Now button linked to an instant payment processor. They spent the next 2 days reaching out to every contact Mark had, past and present. By Friday morning, Mark had booked 4 edits. It wasn't the full amount of rent, but it was more than halfway there. And Dan knew from experience that once momentum started, more work often followed. When Mark sent him a late-night text on Saturday, saying he'd hit his rent target, Dan felt the tension in his own chest ease, tension he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. The following week, Mark called again. I wanted to say thanks. Not just for helping me out, but for not just giving me the money. I would have taken it, but this feels better. Like I actually did something." Dan smiled. "You did do something. You just needed a push." After they hung up, Dan sat for a while with the quiet of his apartment around him. Helping Mark hadn't cost him a dime, but it had reminded him of something he sometimes forgot. Financial stability wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about having the clarity and space to help others in ways that were sustainable. He turned back to his tracker, not to change anything, but to see the numbers once more. The graphs kept their upward climb, steady as a tide. The rules were intact. The home fund had passed $12,000 while he was in Italy. The investments kept compounding. The emergency fund sat untouched. He knew there would be more calls like Mark's in the future. Life had a way of circling back, of putting you in someone else's story for a chapter or two. But now he understood that the real gift of his system wasn't just the security it gave him. It was the freedom to show up for people without undoing the life he was building. That night, before bed, he wrote in his notebook. Money can solve a problem fast, but teaching someone to solve it themselves lasts longer than the problem. The email came on a quiet Wednesday morning. Dan had been working through his task list, the gentle background hum of rain against the windows filling the apartment, when the subject line caught his eye. Exclusive pre-market listing, ideal for first-time buyers. Normally, these real estate emails went straight to his read later folder. He wasn't ready to buy yet. Not by his own rules, not by the timeline his system had laid out. But something made him click this one. Maybe it was the word exclusive. Maybe it was the part of him that still, despite all his discipline, liked the thrill of imagining what could be. The pictures loaded slowly, each one drawing him further in. A top-floor condo, 2 bedrooms, a small balcony overlooking a tree-lined street. The kitchen was modern without feeling sterile, sunlight pouring across the counters in the listing photos. There was even a small alcove that would be perfect for a reading chair. He could almost feel the cool morning air from that balcony, coffee in hand, the city waking below. The price tag was reasonable. Still a stretch for him now, but not outlandishly so. The listing agent claimed it would hit the public market in a week, but pre-market showings were happening that weekend. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the photos, the text, the little details in the corners of each image, the books on the shelf, the potted plant by the window. This wasn't just a property. It looked like his kind of space. Then came the pull, the deep, instinctive urge to act before someone else did. The same urge that years ago might have sent him scrambling for a mortgage pre-approval, trying to make the numbers work on the fly, telling himself he'd figure out the details later. But now there were details, rules, a system that didn't bend for impulse, no matter how beautiful the impulse looked. That afternoon, he went for a long walk in the drizzle, the hood of his jacket pulled low. He let himself think about the place, not in the abstract, but in the math. His home fund sat at $12,100. His target before buying was $20,000 for the down payment buffer, plus another $5,000 for moving and immediate setup. Even if he redirected overflow entirely toward the down payment, he'd be short by several months. The emotional side argued back. This is the kind of listing that doesn't come around often. If you wait for perfect, you might miss great. But the practical side was relentless. This is exactly how people derail themselves. One rushed move, one gap you fill with debt, and the whole point of your patience is gone. By the time he got back to the apartment, his jacket dripping onto the mat by the door, he knew he needed to test his own resolve. That meant running the scenario, really running it, to see what it would cost him in the long term. That evening, he opened his tracker and created a duplicate of his home fund projection. In this alternate timeline, he dropped $8,000 into the down payment column, pulled $1,500 from savings for immediate expenses, and let the rest be covered by the mortgage. The graph shifted instantly. The steady upward slope became a shallow climb. Investments would stall for 6 to 9 months as he diverted money toward catching up. The emergency fund would stay put. He'd never touch it for this, but the overall picture felt tight. Tight in a way he hadn't felt in years. He sat there, the glow of the screen on his face, the rain still whispering against the glass. This was the kind of decision that didn't just affect the next year. It would ripple forward, shaping the comfort, or stress, of every month to follow. And yet, the images of that condo wouldn't leave his mind. On Friday, Sarah called. She'd seen the listing too. "It's perfect for you," she said without hesitation. "I know," he admitted, "but the numbers aren't there yet. Couldn't you just push the numbers? You've been so strict. Maybe this is the exception worth making." Her words weren't unreasonable, but they hit the part of him that remembered Italy, remembered Mark, remembered the times when bending the rules had actually worked in his favor, because they'd been calculated exceptions. The difference now was the scale. "This isn't a $2,000 decision," he said quietly. "It's a $200,000 decision, and I don't want to start it from a place of catch-up." There was a pause. "Then you already know your answer." The showing was scheduled for Sunday. He didn't cancel it. He told himself he just wanted to see the place in person, to confirm whether it was as good as it looked. It was better. The light was even softer than in the photos. The balcony felt private, but still connected to the street. The walls carried that faint, clean scent of fresh paint over something older, something that had seen lives before his. He stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, imagining his books on the shelves, his desk by the window, his morning starting here. The agent smiled. "If you want to make a pre-market offer, we can have paperwork ready tonight." Dan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the one that says move now or lose it. But beneath it was something else, something steadier. The voice that had built his system spoke quietly, almost kindly. Not yet. He thanked the agent, said he'd think about it, and walked out into the gray afternoon. The air was damp, cool on his face. He didn't rush home. He let himself walk slowly, the decision settling in his chest. By the time he reached the street, he felt it, the mix of longing and relief that comes from choosing patience over urgency. The condo would sell to someone else, and that was fine. When his place came, it would come without the weight of compromise. That night, he opened his tracker and deleted the alternate timeline sheet. The graph returned to its steady climb, uninterrupted. The home fund's projected completion date remained the same. He poured a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched the street below. A couple walked past, sharing an umbrella, their laughter carrying up through the damp air. Dan smiled, not because he got in the condo, but because he hadn't. Some doors weren't meant to be opened yet, and knowing which ones to leave closed was its own kind of wealth. It was late April when the message came, tucked between promotional emails and a newsletter he skimmed without reading. The subject line was plain, potential property match, reviewed by request. He almost deleted it, but something in the back of his mind reminded him that months earlier, he'd set an alert for a very narrow range of criteria. Location, price, layout, and the kind of natural light he'd grown to crave after years in spaces that always felt just a little too dim. When he opened the link, his pulse quickened. It wasn't a condo this time. It was a small, standalone townhouse, one with short row, each with a narrow strip of garden out front. The facade was pale brick, the kind that softened in the late afternoon sun. 2 floors, a modest footprint, but with clean lines and windows on 3 sides. The price made him pause. It was lower than he'd expected for the area, not a steal, but fair in a way that made him curious rather than suspicious. He scrolled through the photos. The living room had a corner of floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the small garden. The kitchen wasn't huge, but it had been renovated in the last 5 years, all neutral colors, and a breakfast bar that could double as a workspace. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a narrow balcony with just enough room for a chair and a coffee table. He clicked back to his tracker. The home fund, $20,340. The number looked almost unreal after so long watching it grow in careful increments. His original goal had been $25,000 before buying, enough for a healthy down payment buffer and move-in expenses. He was close. So close that for the first time in years, the math didn't feel like a stretch. That night, he didn't sleep much. He lay in the dark, hearing the faint hum of the city through his slightly open window. The townhouse wasn't the fantasy of the condo from months ago. It wasn't some perfect image lifted from an architectural magazine, but it felt possible, not rushed, not like a temptation to bend the rules. By morning, he decided to see it. The agent, a calm woman named Carla, met him outside the place on a crisp Saturday. The air smelled faintly of cut grass from a nearby park. Inside, the house felt even better than in the photos, not because it was flawless, but because it wasn't. There were tiny scuffs on the wooden floor, a hairline crack in the plaster near the staircase, a kitchen drawer that stuck slightly. It felt lived in. It felt human. As they moved through the rooms, he could picture his life here. His desk by the upstairs window with a morning light poured in, the balcony door open on cool evenings, the faint rustle of leaves in the garden. Carla leaned against the kitchen counter, looking at him with a practiced, neutral expression. "If you're interested, it's been on the market for 9 days. That's longer than average right now. You might have some negotiating room." Negotiating room. The phrase landed softly but firmly. It meant possibility without urgency. That evening, he sat at his desk, a legal pad in front of him. He began to write numbers, the asking price, the amount he could comfortably offer, the down payment he could make while keeping his emergency fund intact, the projected mortgage, property taxes, insurance. The figures lined up better than he expected. If he went in slightly below asking and was willing to keep the furnishings minimal for the first year, he could not only buy it without draining his buffer, but also keep his investments on track. And for the first time in this long process, he didn't feel the need to run an alternate timeline projection. He didn't feel like he was gambling. He was ready. The next morning, he called Carla. "I want to make an offer," he said. They spent the afternoon going over details. He put in an offer 5% under asking, with a strong deposit and a quick close. 2 days later, Carla called back. "They've countered," she said, her tone unreadable. 2% under asking. "They're willing to include the washer or dryer if you agree." Dan stared out the window, watching a lone cyclist pass on the street below. It was fair, more than fair, and the appliances would save him a chunk of money in the first year. "Let's do it," he said. The weeks that followed moved in a strange rhythm. Bursts of paperwork and waiting, signatures and inspections. The home inspection revealed no serious issues, just the same small imperfections he'd noticed before. The appraisal came back exactly at the sale price. When the closing date finally arrived, he felt an odd calm as he signed the last document. This wasn't the jittery adrenaline of an impulsive purchase. It was the steady satisfaction of a goal met without compromise. The keys were cool and unfamiliar in his hand. Outside, the late spring air carried the smell of rain on warm pavement. Moving day was simple. He'd never been one to accumulate much, and what he had fit into a small rented van. The first night, he sat on the floor of the living room, eating takeout from a box while the sun set through the garden-facing windows. The walls were bare, the rooms still echoed slightly, but the space felt alive in a way he hadn't expected. He thought about all the moments that had led here, the discipline, the automated transfers, the nights of saying, "not yet," when the easier answer would have been yes. Every part of the system had played its role, each transfer and budget line a small brick in the foundation that had brought him to this room. That night, as he lay in bed with the balcony door open, listening to the soft rustle of leaves, he realized something. This wasn't the end of the plan. It was the continuation of it, just in a new form. The automation would now feed a home maintenance fund, a furniture fund, maybe even a garden fund. He wasn't starting over. He was expanding. And in the quiet, in the cool air drifting through the window, he felt the deep, unshakable satisfaction of knowing he had walked through the right door at the right time. Not because it was the only one open, but because he'd waited until it opened wide enough to step through without losing his balance. The first morning in the townhouse began in silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of quiet that holds its own weight, a quiet that felt earned. Dan woke before sunrise without an alarm, the unfamiliar angle of light against the wall reminding him he was somewhere new. The faint scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air. He padded downstairs barefoot, the wooden floor cool under his feet. The kitchen was bare except for the essentials he'd brought over in 2 cardboard boxes, a coffee press, a kettle, a stack of plain white mugs. The house still echoed faintly with each step, but instead of feeling empty, it felt open. He brewed coffee slowly, letting the kettle whistle just long enough to fill the space. When it was ready, he carried the mug to the living room and sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the big corner window. Outside, the garden was still damp from last night's rain. Drops clung to the leaves of the small shrubs, and the air through the cracked window smelled like wet earth in spring. He took his first sip and thought, this is what all those not-yets were for. That first week, he moved methodically. He didn't rush to fill the rooms. The living room got a second-hand couch he'd found in excellent condition, a small rug to absorb the echo, and a low table for books and coffee. The upstairs bedroom remained simple, a bed, 2 nightstands, and a dresser. Every purchase was deliberate. He'd set up 3 new automated accounts the night after closing: home maintenance, furniture and decor, and utilities buffer. Each received a small, steady transfer every week. The system felt familiar, but also new, like he'd transplanted the root structure of his financial plan into fresh soil. It was tempting to dip into savings for big items all at once, to make the house complete immediately. But he'd waited years to be here, and now he wanted the process to stretch. He wanted to feel the house evolve with him. Evenings became his favorite part of the day. After work, he'd take a short walk around the neighborhood, learning which streets caught the last of the sunset, which houses had flowers spilling over their fences, which shops stayed open late. Sometimes he'd stop at the corner market and pick up something fresh for dinner. Back home, he'd cook with the balcony door open, the air carrying the scent of whatever was in the oven into the garden below. He'd eat at the breakfast bar, no television, just the sound of the street beyond the window. One rainy afternoon, about a month after moving in, he sat at his desk upstairs and opened his tracker. The home fund was gone now, its final balance having been transferred into the down payment. In its place was a new tab labeled Mortgage and Home Growth. The emergency fund had held steady. Investments had only skipped 1 month during the transition and were already back on track. The graph that used to climb toward a single point, the buy threshold, now stretched forward in a softer slope, branching into multiple goals. It felt less like chasing a finish line and more like tending a garden, slow, patient, alive. Sarah came by one Saturday, carrying a plant in a ceramic pot. "Housewarming gift," she said, setting it on the windowsill. They sat in the living room with coffee, talking about how different the place felt compared to his apartment. "It suits you," she said finally. "Not because it's perfect, but because you were ready for it." Dan smiled. "That's the thing. I could have rushed into something months ago, but I think I needed to know I could wait and still want it." 2 months in, he started to notice the subtle shifts. Mornings felt calmer. He didn't have to push the desk aside to unfold his yoga mat. The garden outside had become a kind of living calendar. First the early blossoms, then the deeper greens of summer. The automation had adjusted effortlessly to the new structure. Money flowed into the right places without him having to think about it. The furniture and decor fund grew slowly, allowing him to buy 1 or 2 meaningful pieces at a time. A solid wooden dining table replaced the temporary folding one. A lamp with a warm amber glow made the living room feel less like a space and more like a place. There were moments, of course, when the old impatience surfaced. A week before his birthday, he saw a sale on the exact armchair he'd envisioned for the reading corner upstairs. The fund wasn't quite there yet. He could have bought it immediately, but instead he set a reminder for the end of the month and closed the browser. When the reminder came, the chair was still available. And buying it then, without breaking the system, made it feel like a small victory, not just a purchase. Summer deepened. One warm evening, he sat on the balcony with a notebook, jotting down ideas for the next phase of his plan. The house was no longer a goal, but a platform. He wrote headings: garden improvements, travel fund, mortgage acceleration. The last one made him pause. It was tempting to throw every spare dollar at the loan, but part of him wanted to balance that with living, with seeing more of the world, like Italy. It struck him then. The discipline he'd built wasn't about denying himself things. It was about giving himself the space to choose without fear. The first big home expense came in late August, when the water heater made a strange, rattling sound. The plumber confirmed it needed replacing soon. The quote made Dan's stomach tighten, until he checked the home maintenance fund. It covered 85% of the cost already, and the remainder would come from the next 2 weeks of transfers. No credit card panic. No reshuffling of accounts, just a straightforward, planned withdrawal. As the plumber worked, Dan stood in the kitchen and thought, "This is why I waited. This is why I built it this way." By early autumn, the townhouse felt like his in a way that went beyond ownership papers. Friends visited and commented on how settled the place felt. Evenings grew cooler, and he found himself lingering in the garden after dark, a small string of lights casting a soft glow over the path. One night, standing there with a mug of tea, he realized something that made him smile. He hadn't thought about moving, upgrading, or what's next since the day he closed. The constant itch for better had quieted. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the first time in years he felt like he was living inside the plan, not chasing it. And in that stillness, he found a kind of wealth he hadn't known he was missing. The year had come full circle. One cool October morning, Dan stood in the garden, hands in his pockets, watching the last of the summer leaves loosen from their branches. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. Somewhere down the street, someone was roasting coffee. The warm, earthy scent drifted past like a memory. A year ago, he'd been in his apartment, looking at listings that made him restless, wondering if the wait was worth it. Now, the townhouse stood solid behind him, every window catching the low autumn light. He'd learned the house's sounds, the way the pipes whispered at night, the faint creak in the stairs' second step, the sigh of the garden door when the wind pushed against it. He knew when the sun would hit the kitchen table and when the balcony would be warm enough for morning coffee. He'd learned how the light shifted through the seasons, and how quiet the street became after the evening rush. The biggest surprise wasn't the house itself, but how much the process of getting here had changed the way he lived. On the anniversary of his closing date, Dan pulled up the master tracker file. He hadn't missed a weekly check-in since he'd created the system years ago, but this one felt different. Not just a review, but a kind of accounting of the entire journey. The mortgage and home growth tab showed steady progress. The furniture and decor fund had filled and emptied several times over, each purchase chosen with care. The home maintenance account had taken the water heater replacement in stride and was back to a comfortable balance. His investments had grown despite the shifting markets, and the emergency fund sat untouched, exactly as intended. It wasn't about the numbers alone. It was about what those numbers meant, that he could live without leaning on credit, that surprises didn't have to become crises, that his financial life ran quietly in the background while his actual life filled the foreground. In early November, he invited Sarah over for dinner. She arrived with a loaf of bread from the bakery down the road, the one Dan had discovered on his first weekend in the neighborhood. They ate at the wooden table he'd bought 6 months after moving in, talking about everything from work to family to travel plans. At one point, she gestured toward the garden. "You know," she said, "you've been here a year and you still talk about this place like you just moved in." Dan laughed softly. "That's because I don't feel like I've finished moving in. Not in a bad way, just I think I like it evolving." She tilted her head. "Most people try to finish as fast as possible. You've slowed it down." "That's the point," he said. "I spent years learning to wait. I don't want to unlearn it now." Winter brought a different rhythm. The garden went bare, and the corner window became a frame for rain streaks and gray skies. Dan adjusted without thinking. Dinners moved indoors. The balcony door stayed shut more often, but the house still felt alive. The automation carried on like clockwork. Each Friday, without fail, small amounts flowed into the funds. Sometimes he'd look at the balances and think about the past, the way he used to believe that saving only mattered if it was done in big, dramatic moves. Now it was the opposite. The small, consistent transfers were the pillars holding everything up. One particularly cold afternoon in January, Dan took a call from Mark. "Guess what?" Mark said. "I just finished my best quarter ever. Those promo edits turned into full campaigns. I've got 2 steady clients now." "That's great," Dan said, leaning back in his chair. "And I've got an actual emergency fund. $2,000 in there already." Dan smiled. "I'm proud of you." Mark hesitated, then added, "You know, if you'd just given me that rent money, I probably wouldn't be saying any of this. I'd still be scrambling." That stayed with Dan long after the call ended. The townhouse, the systems, the trips, they were personal victories. But helping someone else shift their own trajectory? That was something deeper. By March, he had a new rhythm for weekends. Saturday mornings were for errands and small projects around the house. Sometimes it was repairing a loose hinge, sometimes painting a wall, sometimes just rearranging furniture until the space felt new again. Sunday afternoons were reserved for the garden, trimming, sweeping, preparing for spring. It was in those quiet, physical tasks that the financial lessons seemed to echo the loudest. The house didn't stay in perfect condition on its own. Neither did the finances. Both needed regular attention, small inputs, and the discipline to handle problems before they became bigger. Spring returned with color. Blossoms opened in the garden, the balcony became a coffee spot again, and the long evenings pulled him outside more often. One Saturday in April, he sat in the garden with his laptop and began planning a trip for later in the year. He created a new tab, Japan 2026. The automation had space for it now, without affecting the other goals. The idea wasn't just to travel. It was to prove, again, that his system could make big experiences possible without breaking anything else. As he filled in the first line, $50 this week, he felt that old satisfaction rise again. The joy wasn't in spending. It was in knowing that by the time he boarded that plane, the trip would already be paid for. On a mild night in May, he stood in the kitchen with the balcony door open, listening to the hum of the neighborhood. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the path to the garden. He thought about the younger version of himself, the one who avoided looking at bank balances, who thought automation was boring, who didn't understand that patience could feel like freedom. If that version could see him now, coffee in hand, mortgage paid on time, No debt beyond the loan that was shrinking month by month, a life that didn't feel like it was teetering on the edge. Maybe he believed that waiting was worth it. And if someone asked him today how he'd done it, he wouldn't talk about interest rates or market timing first. He'd say, decide where you're going. Build a system to get there. And don't break it. Not for anything that isn't worth the delay. Because in the end, the real reward wasn't the house or the trips or even the balance sheets. It was waking up every day knowing that his money was working quietly in the background, leaving him free to live in the foreground. That was the long game, and he was in it for good.